Sure, absolutely.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Hey, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Hey, before you put this on Facebook, Michael's just asking if you'd heard from Beria.
Disappeared
Okay.
off the map.
I hope she's okay.
Yeah, me too. Rabbi, she loves you so much, and she just talks so highly of you. And she shared with me a list of all of the volumes of Talmud, and she's missing just a few. She's filled her whole house up with this, and I just couldn't imagine it would be voluntary.
When was the last time you spoke with her?
It's been a long time, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So okay. Right. So here's an interesting thing that you asked about yesterday, whatever it was. And now we're going to get into the issue of returning it, right? ולעניין מה שנוהגים לקצת המקומות להחזיר תבשיל לתוך התנור בשבת. Right. So regarding what some people have a custom to also return it, right, back into the oven. מירושלמי שכתב הר"ן, משמע דעד כאן לא אסר תלמודה. Says when Yerushalmi that the Ran brought, it implies that Talmud didn't forbid this only when he took it out before Shabbat. And then he wants to return it after it gets dark. But if he took it on Shabbat, he says, right, you're allowed to return it there, even if he placed it on the ground. So it says, even though that's only talking about returning the kirat grufa to a stove which is raked out, like it says over there explicitly, but if it's not raked out, or a tanur, or we're talking about an oven or kopach, or the kopach sheisiku begefet, right? That they lit it with olive pits or betzim or wood. Afilu garuf katum. Even if it is raked out, so it says everybody agrees that it's forbidden like that. So he says it's possible to say, as we already mentioned, that our oven is like a stove. Kedivri Rabbeinu Hananel, like the Rach. So he says, since by the time that we return it, right, the coals are already like at a low temperature, they're already dimmed down. So therefore, it's considered like it's raked out. Like we said in Gemara, but it says nevertheless, it implies that it's forbidden. Because the Gemara only permits only on top of the stove, but not inside. And they're only allowed to return it when the dish is still hot. That's the thing, it has to be hot. But he says they're accustomed to return it even if it's cold. That's the custom of the Ashkenazim. The old Yerushalmi has this. It's also this Yerushalmi. We don't really hold like that anyway. According to ones who paskin like what we wrote above. We can find them a heter anyway. Mitzad acher, from a different angle. Like it says in the kolbom, so he says in our ovens, din chazara bo kedin lekira gufa. That's like the same as the stove, which is raked out. And once they remove their bread from there, or panada, right, or the panada, which is like pashtida. It's like a pastry, with meat inside. So it says if it's still left over, right, some of its heat until tomorrow, so then it will be allowed to put panadash in there to heat it up. Because it's very little heat there, it's already not so hot. So he says because at that point there is no concern about stirring the coals, because they were already raked out from the day before, from the night before. So it says even if they were not removed, they still have been already consumed. The kahu kol kechalab. And all its coals have been already simmered down, dimmed down. So you don't have to be careful that there shouldn't be any coal whatsoever. Right? So he says, but he says, I'm not so sure about this heter. Mishum de'amar Rav Sheshat, because according to what this rabbi said, afilu b'Shabbat, according to one who says that we can return it even on Shabbat, Piresh Rashi explains, afilu the Yom HaMacharat, even right the day after. In other words, the next morning, ולפי זה, אף ביום המחרת לא שרה אל החזיר. He says, according to this, even in the morning, it's not allowed to return it. אלא בקירה הגרופה וכתומה. Only when it's a stove which is raked out. דווקא ולא בתנור וקלה, but not with the oven at all. ואפשר שלזה נתכוון בעל הכל בו. So he says, it's possible that Kolbo was referring to that. כתב בסוף דבריו, that he wrote in the end of his words, אבל לפירוש רש"י, this is according to Rashi, he says, יש לפקפק, there is some concern here, וכן נראה ודאי שלא נתנו חכמים דבריהם לשיעורים. He says, that's the way it seems correct. Why? Because the rabbis didn't, they didn't make these rules, right, you know, with all kinds of variations. In other words, it's like a standard for everybody. ואף לפי היתר זה, כשכתב הקולבו, so even according to this heter, the קולבו wrote, נראה שאין דבריו אמורים, אלא שאחר שהוציאו הפת, so even when the קולבו said, it says that this was only said where, after they took out the bread from the oven, or a panada, or that pastry, right? לא חיממו עוד, they didn't heat it up again, דכיוון שאפו בו, אז היא להבלה, because once they baked with it, right, the heat is already gone, you know? אבל כל שחיממו כדי להכניס בו קדרת חמין, if they heated it enough, right, to put there a pot, right, of the hot food, לצורך מחר, for tomorrow, nafish havle, that's going to have a lot of heat there, that oven. So you're not going to be able to put in there because it's still hot, you know. So you see from there, by the way, that they had ways, you know, to preserve the heat of the oven, even until the morning after. Even if they raked it out, but he says, in any case, something which is not the way, you know, to bake in the oven. For instance, something with the dough, metuganim, which is fried, b'shemen, fried with oil. Efshar deshara, he says maybe it's allowed. Perhaps it's allowed. Al pi mash katav Ran, according to what the Ran said, the efshar deshara letet panadash. So he says that it's possible that it's allowed to put this pastry al gabe kira on top of the stove, or al gabe kiseh barzel, or some kind of a metal plate, kol shehu mitztamek veralo, as long as it's congealing and bad for it. Shadavar mochiach she'eno naseh ela b'shvil she'yitchamem, because that shows, right, that you're just doing it to heat it up, right, not to cook. So even though heter is not clear, hatam, right, he doesn't have a clear heter, shehu mechameman al aesh mamash, because he's heating it up on the fire. Aval b'kei gabna de lav, but he says in such a manner that the lav al aesh mamash, that's not really on the esh. Mashu efshar de pshita le deshare. It could be that he holds that it's allowed. Kol makom nachon le'asor afilu b'kei gabna. It says, in any case, it's proper to forbid this, he says. Afilu b'kei gabna, even in such a manner, they shouldn't come to permit something which is forbidden. All the more so that it's not really so clear that's heter. כל דינים דשייך אליהם בשל בשבת או מחמם דבר חם או דבר קר בין שמחממו על ידי האור. So it says all issues, you know, regarding pertaining to cooking on Shabbat, whether it's to heat up something, right, or to heat up something hot or something cold, or that it heats it up by way of the fire, atzmo, by itself, or bechama, or in the sun, atzma, or betoloten, or in the derivatives of the sun. Hakol itba'er b'siman shin yud ches. We're going to talk about that there, right, in this chapter, 318. over there it talks about cooking, the issues of cooking, which is related to this, but not exactly the same thing. Okay, great. So that was Bet. Let's see Shulchan Aruch. So it says here, Lo avda ela hobira kula mitzvata. No, not this one, not this one. Sorry. Yeah. So it says here, kira shehi grufa uktuma, right? When you have a stove, right, which is raked out, and he removed the pot, right? Even if he removed it on Shabbat, right? As long as it's still hot, you're allowed to return it. So what does that mean, right? If it's that hot, you can't touch it with your hands. That means you're allowed to return it. What's the reason for that? The reason is because, it's still like on its first cooking, the motor still hot. So therefore, right, it's not like something new. It's like you're just continuing the old action. The first cooking. So therefore, we're allowed to return that, right? As long as it's still hot. So the Ramah brings over here, right? He says ve'odab biado, right? That it has to be still in his hands, though. The truth is, some poskim allow even when he's not holding it. He already put it down. He placed it on the counter, or he placed it on the table. He can still put it back if it's still hot. Anyway, it says here, bedato le'achazira, right? His intention is to return it also, he says the Ramah. The dafka al gaba, that's only on the top. About lo letocha, right? About tocha asu. But you're not allowed to put it inside. Why is that? Because inside the stove, it's like putting inside the oven, similar. So it's too hot there, that's the problem. It's too hot. Looks like you're cooking, so therefore you're not allowed to. So it has to be a stove where it's raked out. Nowadays, we don't rake out anything, right? We have gas, whatever, electric. So therefore, the rule is like this, right? That what we do is we cover it, with as we said, right? The plate or the blech, whatever it's called, right? So, or the plato also. So there you're allowed to return it for sure. There's no question. But otherwise, if you don't have that, right? So then it would be forbidden to return it on the open flame. Okay. So then he goes on, but tanur, what about the oven, right? There you're not allowed to return it, right? Even if it's raked out. Right? Same thing also with kopach. If he lit it up with olive pits, right, or wood. Right? The Rama says that's only if it's fully cooked. Then you're allowed to return it. Otherwise, you cannot return it. Then you're allowed to return it. Even to another stove. But if it's not fully cooked, asur, forbidden. Even to that stove itself. So the question always arises, in these cases, what is called fully cooked? How do you gauge that? So we saw in the Bet Yosef, recently, he says there that fully cooked means that it's fully cooked for most people. Most people will eat it. Right? So if it's rare, it would not be like that. Obviously, right? It would have to be like at least medium, because most people will eat medium, right? So then it's okay. Doesn't have to be well done. Anyway, getting back to the story here. So right, so the Rama brings the other opinion, right, which is on the Bet Yosef, right, in the name of the Ran, that this is only forbidden to return it if you took it before Shabbat. Then you didn't return it until Shabbat came in. But if he took it when it was already dark, right, even if you put it on the floor, it's allowed. So it says we're lenient in our ovens, right? Sheyesh lem din kira, because as we said, right, our ovens are not that hot as the ancient ones, which were made like a pyramid. So it says they rely on the lenient opinion. Custom is to be lenient, it says. But it says good to be stringent though. But it says, however, if it got cold already, the kuli alma asur is forbidden, according to everybody. But some say that if he took out the food from the oven, you're not allowed to put them into, right, all kinds of pillows and mattresses, in other words, to insulate them. Some say if it's very close to being dark, or samuch baruchu, or they're going to say baruchu neshu, close to that, which is that's when we take on Shabbat. If it's already so close to Shabbat, that if the pot will get cold, it's impossible. Wouldn't that be possible to heat it up anymore before Shabbat? Then it would be like Shabbat. It's small. It would be like a Shabbat itself. Right? So it says some are lenient with this. So he says that custom is to be lenient. But it says if there's no big need, it's good to be stringent. But that's only on top of the stove. But put it next to the stove, even to the fire, if put it next to the fire, in a place where it's already, shara, it's allowed, even close to darkness. So he says when it comes to the oven, there's no difference between to put it on top or right to put it next to it. That's only if it's hot, right? But if it's not yatzoledet, sham share, then it's allowed. Afilu b'Shabbat, even on Shabbat. Kemo sheitbaer lekaman siman shin yudchet. Right. So what he's saying here is important, right, to understand. that all the things that we talk about here, not to return it back to the original place, that's only talking about when it's yatzoledet. But if it's not yatzoledet, it's not so hot. So it'll never cook, it's not, doesn't have the power to cook. So therefore, right, you're allowed to put it back. There's no problem. Like we spoke about those special ovens, right, which are not so hot. So, they're not yatzoledet. They have a special Shabbat function, So if that's the case, you're allowed to put it back there. There's no problem. Okay, so I think it's a good idea to review this, it's a lot of stuff here. So we'll go over it one more time. A lot of details. Especially in the Ramah. So let's see what we got here. Right? So if you have a stove, it's raked out, right? And you took out the pot, right, from the top. You're allowed to return it, as we said, right? It's as long as it's still hot. Yatzoledet. So the Ramah also adds the condition that it has to be in your hands still. I don't think we paskin that way. It has to be in your hands. Pretty sure that we don't. So what did he say, right? But the Maran says, he didn't put it on the ground. In other words, once you put it on the ground, you can't return it. But if you put it on the counter, it's not called the ground, right? Obviously, it's something else. So therefore, you should be allowed to do that. No problem. And then says Ramah, his intention is also to return it. So the whole point over here is like this, why do they do this? What they're trying to do is just to like take it off the fire and serve it, serve it to the people. And then put it back. Right? That's pretty much what the scenario is talking about. So as long as it's still hot, you're allowed to put it back. But as long as what? As long as you don't put it on the floor, right? That's something else. Okay, that's the first halacha. Then it goes on, right? But that's only when it's on top. But you're not allowed to put it inside the stove, right? Because as we said, right, in their stoves they had a receptacle, inside. So they didn't want you to put it in there because it's too hot there. Looks like you're cooking. That's the whole thing. Okay, great. So it goes on. Tanur, what about the oven, right? As we said, which, as we said, right, their oven was hotter. Not like ours, right? Ours are not so hot, apparently, right? It could be, by the way, that they are because they're using gas and electric, which makes them very hot. But anyway, right, what's the din with the oven? You're not allowed to return it there, right? Even if it's raked out. Same thing also applies to the kopach if it was lit with the olive pits or wood, because then also it gets very hot. Okay, great. So that's the Shulchan Aruch. Now we got the Ramah. It's very long. So let's go step by step. So says the Ramah, that's only if it was fully cooked, right? And that's the way we paskin. He brings that from Bet Yosef. Has to be fully cooked. Otherwise, you can't return it, right? Because you're cooking if you do that. So by the way, that shows you that you're not allowed to, we don't say here that we paskin like Hananiah, who says, right, Machal ben Drusai, 1/3 cooked. No, that's not enough. In this case, to return it, it has to be fully cooked. No excuses. ויש אומרים לכל זה אינו אסור רק כדי לשנצלו מן הקירה מבעוד יום. So right, some say this prohibition only applies when he took it before Shabbat, and then he wants to return it on Shabbat. But if he took it on Shabbat and he wants to return it, then you can return it even if you put it on the floor. So this opinion is a little bit more lenient. Apparently, we don't paskin like this. But the Ramah says, right there, by them, he says that's a custom. So he says, we're accustomed to be lenient with our ovens. Why? Because they're not so hot, right, as the old ovens. They're like a stove. So therefore, they said we rely on the lenient opinion. But it says good to be machmir about this. Okay. So that would mean, for the Sfardim, probably, they would have to be stringent here, right? For sure. Yeah. What we rely on, nowadays is that we say if the food is dry, and it was fully cooked, and then you're putting it on a plata or on a blech, you're allowed. Because it's not the way to cook like that. That's what we do. Because it doesn't look like you're cooking. Because it's not the way to cook like that. Okay, great. So let's move on. It says, right? But it says if it's already cold, then it's forbidden. So the Ashkenazim, they're lenient with this a little bit. What does that mean? That if it's a little bit warm, they still return it, But if it's totally cold, it's not allowed anymore. But some say if you took out oven, right, the food from the oven, you're not allowed to put it into insulation. Yeah, the truth is, we're not really. I never heard anybody who's stringent about this. This particular instance, because this is not really a full insulation. You know what they're doing here. Okay, whatever. Anyway, some say, right, if it's close to being dark, or close to Baruch Hu, they're saying Baruch Hu Neshu, because that's how we accept Shabbat. If it's right so close to Shabbat that if it got cold, it would be impossible to heat it up before Shabbat. Then it's like Shabbat. So you see what it is, right? With the Ashkenazim, they have lots of variables here, going on, right? With these dinim, But for us, it's more straightforward. No, we don't have all these variables. ויש מקלים בזה, so some are lenient with that, והמנהג להקל. So some are, the custom is to be lenient, he says. Right, so the Ashkenazim were lenient with these things, because of Oneg Shabbat, as we mentioned. Okay, so that's interesting. That's only on top of the right on top of the stove. But it says if you want to just put it next to it, even in a place where it's very hot, it's allowed to do that, right? Because it won't cook like that. Even next to right close to darkness. But tanur en chiluk ben chazir alav or lismoch al. So when it comes to the oven, there's no difference between returning it on top or putting it next to it. But it's only if it's hot. But if it's not so hot, sham share afilu b'Shabbat, then it's allowed even on Shabbat. Okay, so bottom line, right? It's good to know the Ramah is saying over here, if you want to put the food, right, or whatever it is, next to the right, this device, whatever it is. So then, if it's just your garden variety stove, you're allowed to put it next to it, even though it's hot, since it won't get that hot, when it's next to it. When it comes to the oven, we're more stringent, right? Even next to it is forbidden, he says. Okay, that's about it. Okay, fantastic. I guess we can go on unless you have any questions. Okay. So now we're going to Gimel. You just give me a minute. I'll get some water. I'm sorry. 1 second. Give me a second. Okay, sorry about that. So, just to recap, right? What did we just say here? That if you want to return it back to the stove, the food that you took off, if it's totally hot, right? Yatsoledetbo, you're allowed to return it. Just don't put it on the floor. That's pretty much what we're saying. Let's go to Gimel. So it says here, there's a few things here to cover here in the Bet Yosef. So let's see what we can do. So this is Gimel. It says over here, Katu Be'agot Mordechi. Per Gimel. Right? It says over there, Hamashkim Baboker. Let's say a person wakes up in the morning, right? So he sees, right, that his dish is like really getting dried out, right? Burned a little bit, whatever. So he's worried, right? It's going to get totally dried out. Omer Ani, so he says, I say, so he says, what he can do is remove that pot, right, from the stove, whatever, and place there, right, an empty pot, on top of the stove. So now, right, what's going to be is that stove is considered to be already raked out because of this. Why is that? Because that pot is sealing that hole, right, which is in the stove. And then he's gonna put that pot, right, with the food inside it on top of that pot. But he says, don't do that with a new pot, though. Don't use a new pot to be the buffer there. Also, as we said, right, be careful not to put it on the floor, because once you put it on the floor, you can't return it. Because once you put it on the floor, you can't return it, as we said, right? That's the problem. So that's Gimel. Let's see the Shulchan Aruch on that. So it says Shulchan Aruch, Hamashkim baboker v'ra'avek. He wakes up in the morning, right? He looks on the on top of his right, the plata stove, whatever it is, right? He sees that his dish is getting really dried out. So what are we talking about? He left it there all night, right? Chalent kind of thing, chalent. So he's afraid that it's gonna get dry even more, right? Even more dry. It's gonna become a piece of wood. Right? So so as we said, right, what do? Take another pot, right? Remove that pot, take another pot, put it as a buffer, So it's going to have less heat coming out then. So then what do? Right? You put the other pot inside that pot, and this way it'll be colder. It'll cool down a little bit. Right? On top of that one. As we said, right? But don't put it on the floor. Because once you put it on the floor, right, you cannot return it anymore. Right. Also, as we said, right, there has to be yatzoledbo. So Rama points out here, right? This is Kavani Hagim Lakil Afa Im Natana Al Gabi Karka. Says we already wrote in the chapter, right, in the halakha before, that we are even lenient if you put it on the floor, right? The Ashkenazim are lenient about that. So there you go, right? So there is a different custom here with the Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. Once we say, once you put it on the floor, no good, right? But they allow that. Okay, so that's right. Whatever. Who puts it on the floor anyway, right? Who puts a pot on the floor? People don't do that, right? They put it on the counter. You know what I mean? Whatever. Right? You get the point. In the old days, they put it on the floor. You know why? Because they had nowhere else to put it. They didn't have a counter. They didn't have nothing, right? Things were a little bit different in those days. Okay, great. That's Gimel. We got a little bit more time. We can go on. So next one is Dalid. So it says Katu Be'agot Mordechai Pet Gimel. It says over there, no, not this one. I'm sorry, that's Gimel. No, looking for Dalid, but can't find it. Seems like there is none. Oh, here it is. Okay, found it. Okay. So it says like this, right? Katuv Nimuki Yosef. It says in his book, Resh Perek Lo Yachpor, the Shem Rabbeinu Yonah, right? Name Rabbeinu Yonah. It says, ומכשילה תאכל גלולה תחת מקצת העם שטומנים קומקום של מים. So he says there's a big problem, right? That some people do, a certain kind of like a solution for this problem that we just mentioned, but it's not halachically sound. So what do? Right? What they do is they put like a teapot full of, boiled water on top of the stove. They insulate it, so it keeps hot. So what they do is like this, right? That a certain dish, right, is getting dry. So they want to add water to it, to keep it moist. So what they do is, right, that they take from that teapot and pour it into the dish, which is getting dried out. So he says the problem is like this, right? Sometimes one of them is not so hot. It's not yad soledbo. And the other one is mitbashel ze in ze. So what happens is, right, that the hotter one cooks the colder one. So it comes out you're cooking on Shabbat. But it says even though they're not boiling, im paska koach retichutan, yesh behem mishum bishul. So it says if they're not, boiling, in other words, they are hot, but if they're not totally boiling, so then it's sort of like, it stopped cooking. And then what happens is you pour the other one, which is hotter, into it, whatever, and it starts cooking again. So it turns out you're cooking on Shabbat. That's what it said Rabbeinu Yerucham, בחלק ג' ובשם רשב"א כתב להתיר לתת מים לחמים לתוך הקדרה, but the Rashba seems to allow this, right? אפילו בשהי עומדת על הקירה, even though it's standing on the stove. וכל בו, כל בו כתוב שיש להיזהר מלתת מים חמים בעוד קדרה על האש, לפי שהן מערבות ומגיסות בקדרה. So Kobo says you got to be careful, right, not to put hot water while the pot is on the fire. Because they now, right, well, they stir, they combine and stir up in the pot. So what happens is that he's causing it to stir. And when you stir it like that, the pot, right, you're making it boil harder, stronger, so it's cooking. You're cooking. Even if it's already totally cooked. While it's on the fire. So it says the Ran, and in this parak, Yudchet Amud Aleph, regarding the story that they did, there's something there. And Tveria, people in Tveria, Katav Lefi, Rashi, it says, according to Rashi, Mashi Anu, Noagim Liten B'Shabbat, Maim Bushalim, L'Toch HaChamin. So it says, our custom is to actually add the hot water right into the dish. Different custom. It says, it seems like it's forbidden though. Because it says in such a manner, it's called insulation. Leshmatin, Aval Betosefot, but it's in Tosot, Anu. So it says no, something which is mixing together, it's not called insulation. So it says in this parak, the Ran says, he was a Rabbeinu, and he was wondering about that. He says, I don't know how he got that. So because whatever comes into the hot water, when you finish Shabbat, before Shabbat, we're allowed to soak it in hot water, even though it's totally cold. I don't know the difference, he says, between water which is cooked or some other substance. So it's therefore we need an examination about this. Says this rabbi, seems to me that Rabbeinu holds that which we said, that which came something hot, talking about something hot, dry, like a chicken, but when it comes to something which is hot, something which is wet, moist, like water or tafshil, right, or some kind of a dish, once it, right, I think somebody's pressing on these etching buttons. Somebody's etching on the paper on the daf.
It was a mistake. I was trying to. I thought only I could see that, and I was experimenting with trying to.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No problem. So, anyway, as we said, something which is moist, like water or a dish, like a soup, whatever, if it stopped boiling, there's still cooking there involved, even though it's already cooked. But that's zo, I think I should see end of it. But that's zo, she's Kira Gaon, says that which is the opinion that he wrote the Gaon. He dat Rabbeinu b'siman shin yud ched. This is the opinion of Rabbeinu, right, in the Tur, in this chapter. So it says it's proper to object against this, whoever is lenient about this, because there are several rabbis who forbid this. Okay, that's the end of it. We went a little bit long, but let me just see what's in the Shulchan Aruch here. So it's very short. I'll just read it. So it says, "Yesh limchot b'yad hanogim latmin b'bet yom kimkum shel mayim chamin notrin otam latoch hakederah b'shabbat shetafshid misamek." Right. So, as we said, right, that says the Shulchan Aruch, if you have, if you don't do this, method where you have like some hot water, right, on the stove, ready for, right, to add it to your cholent, right, to make to make it less dry, because it's drying out. So the reason why we don't want to do this, as we said, right, is because it could be that one of them is not so hot. So then one will be cooking the other, by pouring one into the other. This is the reason why we don't want to do it. So therefore, right, there are other solutions that you can do if your dish is getting dried out. But this is not one of them. Right? But says the Rama over here, right? Look in chapter, 318, because over there I think he's lenient about this. So the Ashkenazim are lenient about this, to put the hot water in there like that. So what does that mean? They're not so concerned, that one of them is gonna be, cold and one hot. And there are reasons for that. When we get there, B'ezras Hashem, we'll talk about that. But anyway, the Ashkenazim are lenient about this, but we the Sfaradim, we don't add hot water to the dish on Shabbat. Okay, thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov. So Shabbat Shalom. So we'll have B'ezras Hashem, a break here now, because it's going to be Tisha B'Av. So we'll get back into action probably Monday night after Tisha B'Av. So we'll see you then. Have an easy fast. God bless. All the best.
God bless you, Rabbi.
Nice to see you, Michael.
Hey, can I ask you a question while this is on the screen here? You said 318. I'm looking at Shin Yud, and then there's two little
Shin Yud
apostrophes.
Chet. Shin Yud Chet.
Chet. Yeah, that's 318. But when you see those little marks on the top, it looks like quotation marks. Does that mean that is you're looking at gematria to use that as a number?
It's an abbreviation.
Okay.
God bless. All the best.
God bless.